Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome everyone to this webinar. This is the 8th Urbis Dialogue, and we're very happy to have you with us today. My name is Luisa. I work for the ICLEI Capacity Center, and I am supporting this webinar from the technical side. I want to introduce you to how we use the system that you have logged onto. So, for the duration of the presentations that will be given, you will be muted. However, we welcome your questions, suggestions, and comments to the presentations throughout the webinar. Please type them in the question box in front of you to us. We will then get back to these questions in the end in our question and answer session. Also, if you experience technical difficulties, feel free to type them in the question box and I will help you as far as I can. I really hope you enjoy this webinar with us. Over to David Maddox, who will facilitate this webinar with us.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Urbis Dialogues, the Urban Biosphere Initiative. Today's webinar is called The Urban Commons, the many ways in which nature in the city serves as a commons resource, not just a private state or public good. You can see our website down at the bottom of the screen. The Urban Biosphere Initiative is a partnership among many scientists and practitioners around the world. The partners you can see on the screen right now and the advisory board. The secretariat is ICLEI in Cape Town. The Urbis Dialogues are a series, a 15-webinar series, a global platform for online dialogue. We hold it every Thursday of the month, every first Thursday of the month, in this case, the second Thursday of the month, and they are archived for repeated viewing. They bring together representatives of cities and local governments and leading experts from around the world to share their experiences on specific urban challenges focusing on sustainable use, regional biodiversity, ecosystem services, and city building. The next Urbis Dialogue will be held on February 4th, Greening the Built Environment, the Face and Purpose of Architecture is Changing, led by Shackleton. Today's webinar, the Urban Commons. We have three speakers. First up is Harini Nagendra, who is the organizer of this webinar. Harini is Professor of Sustainability at Premji University in Bangalore. Her research examines issues of social ecological sustainability in forests and cities in the global south. Professor Nagendra is a recipient of the 2013 Eleanor Ostrom Senior Scholar Award for her research and practice on issues of the urban commons. Her book, Nature in the City, Bangalore in the Past, Present, and Future, is forthcoming with Oxford University Press, India, in April 2016. Please welcome Harini Nagendra.
Thank you, David. Welcome to everyone. This webinar focuses on the theme of the urban commons. Garrett Hardin in 1968 talked about the tragedy of the commons. The tragedy of the commons from his perspective meant that any area that was used by a community in terms of their resources needed to be managed instead by the state or by private interests, because he believed that communities were not capable of successfully governing natural resources. It's been a long while since 1968, and thankfully we now have hundreds of examples around the world that show us the local communities can successfully and sustainably manage their natural resources in different parts of the world in diverse contexts. So the tragedy of Garrett Hardin's work, though, has remained that many people still persist with the assumption that communities cannot govern their resources and you must turn things over to the state or to private interests, and no kind of place exemplifies that as much as cities do. if you look across the world in cities, whether they're in the global north or the global south, in whichever continent you see, urban planners, policy makers, just the regular person on the street, in fact, often does not really think that people can manage their resources sustainably and use them as communities. They tend to say that the government, whether the local government or the municipality, needs to step in, or corporate interests need to step in, or private management needs to take over natural resources. In doing so, what we fail to realize is that just as they play a very important role in rural areas, commons play as much of an important role in cities as well. And so hence the purpose of this entire webinar, to try and come up with examples around the world or discussions around the world. And we encourage you as the audience also to come in with your questions and discussions of this, to highlight issues of the urban commons and show you how commons, though neglected, need to become more of an issue when trying to plan sustainable cities, inclusive cities, resilient cities. With that said, I'm going to move to my presentation, which is the first of these, and which comes from examples from Bangalore, which is one of India's fastest growing cities. So this is our presentation. This is with colleagues at Azim Premji University and the Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and the Environment, my colleagues Seema Mundoli and Hita Unnikrishnan. Commons that provide the importance of Bangalore's ecosystems, or Bengaluru's ecosystems, for urban resilience. Now, urbanization in India is expanding extremely rapidly. For a country that was and is still predominantly rural, we are now at 31% of an urban population. It's expected to get to a point where in the next 15 or 20 years, the country surpasses a 50% urban population, which means from a predominantly rural country, it will transform in character to a predominantly urban country. Now, this is a huge change. And we have national policies that are trying to gear up for this with visions for urban development. With 100 smart cities propounded across India, these smart cities are the latest guidelines, for instance, on the ministry website say that smart cities are for smart people who can therefore use high quality infrastructure, especially ICT technologies with web-enabled internets, Wi-Fi access, etc. There is also some discussion of a smart environment. But what is the smart environment that they talk about? The smart environment and the envisioning of the smart environment at the policy level remains fairly limited. It talks about issues like pollution control. It talks very briefly about biodiversity support. But it also talks about cultural and recreational importance of having nature in cities. If you read these documents carefully, what they essentially say is that nature in cities or ecosystems in cities are important for recreational needs, and they don't take into account the livelihood or subsistence needs that ecosystems in cities provide. Especially, they ignore the provisioning services provided by green and open spaces, which act as urban commons, places that provide fuel and fodder and are used by communities sustainably for all kinds of subsistence support, nutrition, livelihoods. And this is especially important in the global south context because the people who depend on these ecosystems as commons, as areas that they use not just for recreation but use to withdraw resources from, are typically the urban poor, practitioners of traditional livelihoods like fishers or fuel or grazers, and migrant workers into the city who don't have access to water or food or fuel wood or other sources of heating. So these are the people that in any case get disadvantaged the most in cities and depend most on these urban commons. If you look at the way urban ecosystem services have been classified, they've been classified into 4 categories by the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. And this very well-known categorization says that there are the services are provisioning services, supporting services, cultural services, and regulatory services. Of these, this is not unique to Bangalore or to Indian cities, but I would argue to cities everywhere. Provisioning services typically get left out of the entire discussion. We do acknowledge that you need ecosystems or parks, wetlands, lakes, and those kinds of areas in cities for soil formation, for nutrient cycling, for water purification, pollution reduction, for recreational uses, educational uses. We don't think of ecosystems in cities as providing wood and fiber, or fuel, or fish, or grazing material. that is something that we tend to think of more happening in rural areas. But if you look at Bangalore, Bangalore being one of India's largest cities and one of India's most famously fast-growing cities, which is also spawned of words like Bangalore in a new word to the dictionary, which was added a few years ago, which basically talks about offshoring of jobs. So this city, with its offshore jobs and various other kinds of capital that has flown into this city over the past couple of decades, has expanded hugely. You have various types of commons. You have wells, you have lakes, you have urban sacred groves or village forests called gundatops. You have cemeteries, grazing lands, and street trees, which also serve as commons of one kind or another. We have ongoing research on the urban commons in Bangalore, which we have been working on from 2006 onwards. And right now this covers research from 97 different villages, peri-urban villages across the city, 20 lakes within the city, and 47 slums where nature and vegetation also access common pool resources because it's not planted within the house and not in private boundaries, but really in areas of the slum that everyone can access. We have looked at these in diverse ways. We survey biodiversity, map the land cover, observe what people do with vegetation, and interview expert informants. We find a lot of use of urban commons in a city like Bangalore even today. Fish is caught in lakes, used for household consumption and sale, so it supplements their protein intake. But also the fish in the city, much of the fish in the city comes from the city's lakes. Cultivation of millets, of rice and vegetables for sale and home consumption. When lakes dry up, as you can see from this woman who's picking leafy greens from the lake bed, during times of drought, when there is not enough fish and not enough water available to grow agricultural crops, people traditionally depended on these greens which grow on lake beds, which provide them with nutrition. If you look at village forests, they were always planted with fruiting trees like mango or what is called a local fruit called jamun. These trees were also occasionally cut for fuel wood or for construction of houses. In slums, you find trees, because of the limited space, are highly native. The high proportion of these trees are native species and they're useful in some way or the other. So you have trees like drumstick or mango or coconut, a variety of plants that again provide nutrition, and shrubs and medicinal plants. Lakes are also used for washing and watering livestock. They support the livelihood of dhobis so they collect clothes from. So the livelihood of launderers is supported by these lakes, as well as hundreds of people who depend on these. And household uses, domestic uses, such as drinking, cooking, washing, and bathing, are supported especially for the most vulnerable, who come from two categories. The first being traditional communities that lived in rural areas, after which at some point the city expanded to swallow them. So they continue to be dependent on water. For instance, they may not have piped water connections, and they have traditional practices for which they still require water from the lake. The second is migrant labor, which comes in, especially construction labor, for constructing and supporting this huge construction boom in the city. And they again lack access to water, to piped water for most of their uses, and so they tend to use these commons resources. There is a range of provisioning services, therefore, that get derived from these commons. We have seen the use of fodder from lake bed and marshy areas, of fuel wood for cooking, for bathing, heating water, for all kinds of other uses, also religious uses, from trees and shrubs. Mud that is taken from dry lake beds for the making of bricks, mud bricks. Fish, of course, fishing is a very important activity in the city. And oil from oilseed bearing trees which grow around in these areas. Medicinal services are also provided from these areas. Herbs and plants, for instance, are grown in slums and common areas to treat ailments at home. And slum residents lacking money, typically these are home remedies that prevent you from going to the doctor unless you fall very sick. So this is again a very important component of their resilience. Greens like this green that this lady is holding in her clothes are harvested from around the lakes and consumed for their medicinal value. It's also important to note that these add to the nutritional value. For instance, fish give protein, and protein is scarce in these diets. Also, nutritional value of greens in these kinds of diets is extremely important. We've So when we started looking at a series of conversions of commons in peri-urban areas, we find that many of these peri-urban areas, as the city swallows them, commons get converted into private use, public use, or become gated. So for instance, groves, village groves get converted to schools or community halls or housing, and policymakers fail to understand that these are ecosystems with service commons, because the idea is they're there to serve the public, so they can serve the public if it's a primary health center or if a school comes up in this area. It doesn't really need to continue to be a grove, for instance. There are sites of degradation where solid waste is dumped and you have public toilets in these areas. There are sites of encroachment. Many of these have been built on or cultivated. The second kind of exclusion is from gating, because many of these areas which do get protected get gated and to serve recreational and aesthetic needs of urban middle class and wealthy residents. These kinds of communities, commons, once they get gated, they exclude and crowd out the livelihoods and subsistence needs of the urban poor. And the way they do this is they have timings for entry, so you can come in the morning or the evening. You have signposts that say that the local resident welfare association can decide whom to let in and whom not to let in. You have patrolling by guards, and they're landscaped for exclusion by focusing on recreation. So traditional sacred uses or cultural uses of these spaces which had their local gods that people worshipped also do not have space anymore. What does this tell us about the future? If we go back to the smart cities programs, the new smart cities are supposed to be funded with 85% of their money being raised from public-private partnerships. And what we've seen of the commons, for instance, we've looked at lakes and parks in the city, which have been funded through these private-public partnerships. What that does is gate original residents of the city and marginalized migrant poor out via fences, gates, and ticket fees, and by restrictions of the kinds of uses of withdrawal of water, withdrawal of food, which are no longer permitted in these areas. And so what this does is you might have a restored common that supports things like pollution control or biodiversity, but it does not support the resilience of the urban poor. So in conclusion, in India, we are seeing the locus of poverty shifting from the rural to the urban, and therefore we really need to focus our attention on how to increase the resilience of the urban poor. Urban commons become very important at two levels here. One is for resilience of the entire city, and the city of Madras, for instance, Chennai, was flooded in recent times, a couple of months ago, and the city of Mumbai was flooded about 4 or 5 years ago. Flooding in both these places has been because of destruction of the urban commons and their building and conversion into built spaces. So urban commons are definitely important for the resilience of the city, but more important, I would argue, or as important, they're needed for the resilience of the people, especially the most marginalized of people. So what we need to look at is how we can reconceptualize cities of the future through the lens of the commons, as these are the places where people use, people protect, and people, so it's by the people, for the people. With that, I'll end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harini. Next up, we have Janice Aspirin. Janice is a research associate at Durham University, where she is currently looking at urban living labs in Europe within the project Governance of Urban Sustainability Transitions. She recently shifted her focus to academic research after more than 20 years of involvement in program design, management, and evaluation with international organizations, philanthropic organizations, NGOs, and community organizations. Her experience of supporting community environmental initiatives and of being herself an active citizen led her to her current interest in citizen engagement with urban nature and its contributions to social and ecological resilience. Please welcome Janice.
Hello there. Are you seeing my screen right? Okay, I'm going to speak about a slightly different sort of urban commons, but using similar elements that Harini spoke about. So I'm intrigued by transformations happening in cities in different parts of the world, and a lot of the work I will talk about is UK and Canada based, but it is, I think, applicable to many cities throughout the world, and it reflects the growing urbanization and people increasingly, right, increasingly making their homes in the cities. So whereas cities in their origins were perhaps a place where people went to market and then to work, cities are now home, and home is something that expands beyond the place that we actually pay to sleep in. And there's a need for people feel a need to actually appropriate more space and make it their own. There's also a need, as we become more urbanized, for opportunities to connect with nature, and there's increasing awareness of how the effects of health and well-being if we don't have that contact, and how it's necessary to have that contact very nearby and easily accessible. And also the sort of relationships that we seem to want to nature seem to be changing. So while there are still needs, as Harini has just described, for people to meet some of their basic needs for survival, to see urban nature as having a utilitarian survival need, and also for some time there was a sense of a sort of cities were to serve a passive, the relationship was supposed to be passive, but what we're seeing everywhere in the world is seeking a more interactive relationship with nature, where we actually want to be involved in cultivating or stewarding or feeding birds. And intriguingly, this tendency to want to be in a more mutualist relationship with nature is being seen worldwide. And interesting research done in 2007 found it to be correlated with increasing urbanization and identifiable in places as diverse as the US, Thailand, Estonia, Netherlands, Mongolia, Malaysia, Uganda, and Kenya. So this requires a different sort of urban common, so beyond the utilitarian and beyond the passive. So we're looking now at something where, sorry. Yes, we're moving from a grazing to gazing to engaging. And in fact, at the same time realizing that, of course, the grazing and gazing still exists. So in this case, in a park in Manchester, where we see on the right what was for a number of years a carefully manicured formal garden, and currently with half of that being taken over by local community groups to actually cultivate food for their own enjoyment as well as their nourishment. So these new forms of appropriating urban space are creating tremendous transformations in cities. So here we see a case in Montreal where over 20 years its condition moved from what you see on the left to what is now described as a country lane in the middle of the city through the efforts of citizens. And there are multiple spaces in cities that are ready and waiting for such transformation, as we find ourselves with post-industrial sites, vacant lots, alleyways that might have once served for deliveries and other needs, canals and other transport infrastructure. And the transport infrastructure is an interesting one, in part because infrastructure essentially serves a function of moving things, but it also frames the way many goods and services are produced and distributed. And there are very interesting opportunities, as well as there being spaces that need changing there because there is nothing happening there, or they no longer serve their previous use. There are many that need changing because we can do them more effectively using forms of green infrastructure, which are multifunctional. They work with the ecosystem services, and they're very resilient. And also interesting about these is that citizens can both make and use these sort of green transport corridors, whereas they can't build multi-lane highways. Some of the things citizens build in what might be a corridor like an alleyway, of course, make them far from negotiable with your bicycle or anything else. But these spaces offer multiple other ecosystem services. And Harini has just actually gone through with a much nicer diagram the different types of services. But in an alleyway like this, neighbors are able to identify that they are enjoying the provisioning for their food. They're collecting water primarily for watering their plants. They remark with excitement on the presence of bees pollinating all their vegetation, and their biodiversity has gone from a couple of things that were trying to sprout out in between the paving stones to hundreds of species. And they're enjoying heat regulation here, water retention, which, as you've heard in the UK, with the increasing risk of flooding, this has become, not to mention, of course, the cultural, as people meet and eat in these spaces. The ecosystem services are, I think, an interesting frame when we think of looking at a lot of the work that was previously done on the commons around community-based natural resource management and how to govern that, to moving towards one where we think more in terms, how do we work with ecosystem services? How do we collaborate with nature to produce them? And there are the similar issues around decision and governance of use of these services. So in this case, which is also in Manchester, where clearly there was agreement that the work of the local community residents would serve as a place people can enjoy, and to some extent providing them with food, and in this case a herb garden, but a lot of discussion about how to make sure people cut a few and didn't go off with the plant. But they weren't so sure about fuel wood. So when they came out one morning and discovered that one of the decorative edges of the garden had been taken away and burnt, they thought that was very amusing, and they moved it back. But that sort of elicited a whole discussion about, well, you know, why not? If people need to sit in parks and keep warm, maybe that's fine. So these different forms of this people-nature collaboration itself is creating resilient situations. And also, when there are different forms of governance, it means that there are many sort of diverse approaches, and that itself is another element of resilience. So we end up with the social, cultural, biological diversity, the working with ecosystem services, the social capital, and the capacity to adapt and transform. And these overlaps in governance where people are experimenting in different ways, filling some gaps. So filling gaps, offering alternatives to what the state might be doing. So the question is, though, are these efforts actually appreciated, recognized? And I recently wrote a blog entry in The Nature of Cities about the story of Parc Oxygène that was created and maintained by its neighbors over a period of 20 years, again in the center of Montreal, where they turned a laneway which had been a dangerous place for children who were playing because there were cars speeding through taking a shortcut. But Parc Oxygène began to feel threatened, and there was an effort by the local residents to get the local authority to actually purchase the space, which was privately owned, and turn it into a park. But unfortunately, this didn't work, and last summer, Parc Oxygène was actually bulldozed, and which was a tragedy for all around. And what was interesting about this was that one of the things that could have saved it was a potential right-of-way, and that made me think about, but is there not a right of care and concern and investment? So can you not claim a commons and protect it because you are fully engaged in it? So the value of such places is not currently recognized. This is, one of many stories where places that have been transformed have been removed, and often to replace it with something of lesser value. And when David Harvey talks about his right to the city, and that it is a right to change and change our cities and to reshape process of urbanization, a lot of the other aspects that he speaks to in his work on the right to the city is how the places where people live and enjoy are often displaced for activities of higher value. And while, of course, he's often talking about some of those key issues like housing and livelihoods, the ability also to occupy places which are meeting needs of health and well-being and to actually appropriate places and make them home and change them is similarly at risk. So there's a need, I think, to look at some new mechanisms. And one of them is about trying to account for the value of space engagement and give them some, through whichever means this is done, make their value evident in the way that, you know, real estate speculation is so easily valued. And also to try and look at, are there different designations we can come up with of the claims of a right to care and designating places as of community concern, and can we encourage and support experiments in transferring management to citizens? So, for example, when this former bowling green was handed over to a group of young people who want to turn it into a sustainability demonstration center. So, and otherwise, just appropriate your comments. Thank you.
Many thanks, Janice. Next up, we have Charlie Shackleton. Charlie is a research professor in the Department of Environmental Science at Rhodes University, Grahamstown, South Africa, where he has been for 15 years. He occupies a nationally funded research chair in interdisciplinary science and land and natural resource use for sustainable livelihoods. Charlie has decades of research experience and numerous publications around rural livelihoods and natural resource use, management, and sustainability, which he has more recently been applying to urban systems over the last several years. His urban sustainability work has focused largely on nature use and inequities in urban forestry and green spaces in small towns in developing countries. Please welcome Charlie Shackleton.
Thank you very much, Dave. And also thanks very much to Harini and Janice for providing some interesting and stimulating background information from their case studies. I will be focusing my presentation on Africa with an emphasis on practices from urban commons relating to non-provisioning of urban commons. I won't be touching on that today. As we're well aware, there's been steady increase in populations, urban populations across all continents of the world, and such increase is usually accompanied by a decrease in the amount of urban commons or public urban green space, as you see in the slide before you. This is from Moshi, which is a medium-sized town in Tanzania, and you can see the decrease in the green area between the two time periods as illustrated there, between 2003 and 2013. So what was green space in 2003 is shrinking over the subsequent decade, and there's a loss of the ecosystem services provided by that space during that intervening period. And what we also commonly find as there is loss of urban commons is that the distribution of the remaining urban commons is not equitable or equal through different parts of a given city or town. So the graph on the left there shows you the amount of public green space per capita between different parts of South African towns, graded by relative affluence, and you can see the amount of public green space is a lot higher for residents living in affluent suburbs than it is for residents living in what we in this country term township suburbs, which are poorer than the affluent ones, and the poorest RDP suburbs where there's relatively little public green space per capita. If you move your attention to the graph on the right, the same pattern is reflected public streets, the township not much better, and then the residential in blue, the more affluent suburbs, is considerably higher. What you also find, which I'm sure Harini and Janice have already alluded to, is the change from public to private green space. So you can see here the same three suburbs reflected in terms of affluent, township, and RDP, and the proportion of green space that is public relative to the proportion of green space that is in private hands. And you can see there's a far larger proportion in private hands than there is in public public green space. This is also reflected in the same town of Mushi in Tanzania on the left, and Palaboa on the right, the change between 2003 and 2013. And you can see the loss of trees in the public green space and the privatization of those spaces, or the enclosure of the commons, I think is how Harini referred to it. Yet we have ample data, lots of data from different countries. Before you use an illustrative graph of a study that was done with colleagues from Freiburg University in Germany, using a similar or using the same approach, so the data are comparative, and it shows you the proportion of urban households, it was a random sample, that are making use of at least one natural resource from urban spaces. And by natural resource, I'm referring to things such as firewood, which Janice has just referred to, things such as wild fruits, wild foods, fibers for roofing, fibers for making mats, and the like. So you can see the proportion of households making use of at least one such resource, and then the number underneath shows the mean number of such resources per household. And you can see the numbers are significantly high, certainly in West and through Central African countries, somewhere between 90 and 100% of households making use of natural resources from urban spaces, and that the mean number of resources is quite high. In the more arid and perhaps also more developed regions of southern Africa, those numbers do drop to some extent. So where do urban households collect these resources from? The graph before you shows location, and the graph is split in two. On the left-hand side, you can see here the proportion of households that are collecting from their home garden, the space that is designated either formally, informally, either with title deed or customary deed, but the space that is designated as their home space, over which they have certain controls to harvest resources and to alienate other people from doing so. And on the right-hand side, you see the proportion who collecting it from the urban commons, which is more open to other people for anyone to collect from. Obviously, the regulations around collecting such resources vary from country to country and even from town to town within a single country. But what we can get from this figure here is that people make use of a wide range of spaces for different resources to meet their everyday or less than everyday household needs. And the proportion of the household need that comes from this urban collection can be quite significant. The graph before you shows that the mean proportion of household income, by that I mean both cash and in-kind income, that comes from collection and use of urban resources averages around about 1/5 of total household income. So one tends to think of urban households and urban communities being locked into and very dependent upon the formal economy, the formal cash economy, but the proportion of the value that they receive that coming from these urban resources can be very high indeed, and averages across the data we've got here at around about 20%, 1/5. And what's more, the proportion of households using these wild resources at the moment in sub-Saharan Africa does not seem to decline with duration of time a household is spent within an urban setting. So with rapid urbanization and migration from rural areas to towns and cities, there is a hypothesis or an expectation that use of such resources may well decline as households become more engaged in the formal economy. That certainly doesn't seem to be the situation as illustrated by the picture in front of you. Indeed, the use of construction wood and firewood was higher amongst urban residents and households who have been longer in the city than recent migrants. There's also been some mention from the previous two speakers around the importance of resources from the urban commons in times of need, in times of household shock, such as through retrenchment or loss of formal cash income, maybe flooding, ill health, and so on, where at a time when a household has to find extra resources to cope with the shock. And here we can see the importance, the proportion of the value of the response to such a shock represents somewhere between 40 and 70%. So these urban commons and the resources that they provide are not only important for everyday use, but they're particularly important as a way of natural insurance in times of heightened need. So what do we see, if I can sort of try and tie it all together, is, well, with the extent of urbanization, we see a decline in the public urban green space or the urban commons and an increase in private green space. But because there are greater population numbers and increasing numbers in urban areas, the aggregate demand for natural resources from urban commons is increasing. So urban governance institutions and authorities are going to have to figure out ways, models, and adaptive processes to manage for sufficient supply of urban resources, both for urban resilience as well as individual household resilience. Thank you very much.
Hey, thanks, Charlie, and thanks to all of the speakers, Harini, Janice, and Charlie, for giving those presentations. We can now turn to the question and answer periods. Everyone is welcome to type a question into the question box. And I'd like to start with a question to really all of you. The transition in cities around the world from public, open, and green space to private spaces is happening all over the world in many cities, where there's a persistent decrease in the availability of open and green space to citizens. Why is that happening around the world, and how, more importantly, how can it be reversed in places like India and South America and so on? What is the mechanism to stop this privatization of public green space? Harini, would like to take the first shot at that?
One of the things I do see in India, and I think Charlie had some of this in his presentation, is that and so did Janice, that when people start claiming their own spaces back, that's what needs to happen for cities, because it seems like if you wait for municipal governments to wake up and realize that cities belong to the people who live there, you can sort of keep waiting and hold your breath and maybe pass out from the lack of oxygen, but not much will change beyond that. So, but when communities come together to claim their spaces, peacefully through civic engagement, through Occupy Your Green Spaces movements, through community agriculture, through taking over their lakes or their parks and organizing them, it seems that makes a big difference. And that one movement, one success really inspires a lot of other people and a lot of other communities to try doing things. So this is something we have seen a lot in Bangalore. When one community succeeds, even though another 10 might have failed along the way, this one success inspires another 100 along, to start networking with this community and try to see if you can create a larger movement.
And how do you tell those stories? How does one community hear about the successes of reclaiming their public spaces? How do we tell those stories within cities, among neighborhoods? But especially, how do we tell those stories among cities across larger geographic spaces? Janice or Charlie?
Charlie?
Well, it's a challenging question. So I don't think there's any one answer particularly. This is a global dialogue we have here, and what may work in India or in the UK may not necessarily work in South Africa, and vice versa. It depends upon the approachability of government officials. It depends upon the approachability of media to think whether this is an interesting or stimulating or sexy topic that they would like to portray, and that differs very widely between regions. Our experience here is that with rapid urbanization in many sub-Saharan towns, that governance systems are pretty overwhelmed. They're quite happy to listen to what you have to say, but then they don't really know, or they don't have the capacity or the budget or the time to implement it. So it really does come down, I think, a little bit to what Harini was saying, is creating partnerships with officials, with civil society, CBOs and the like, and trying to get some real success stories on the table that then can be, what should we say, advertised, that can go into the media, the local media, for other cities within the same province, the same state, and the same country to learn from.
Janice, one of the things I've been curious about in Montreal, the Parc Oxygen case, the people took charge of in creating an open space, and then they lost it through a government action. What was the reaction of the broader Montreal population to the loss of Parc Oxygen?
Well, I'm probably not the best place because I haven't been there since in the post-Parc Oxygen period. But what I would suspect is that there's a tremendous sense of loss and frustration. And I think essentially related to the question you just asked about how you tell the stories. And Parc Oxygen was an effective story because it was very right in the center of the city, actually in a very densely populated area and with a lot of movement through it, including sort of one of the main bike lanes through the city. And it was included in tours of local green and citizen action and things. So I think the fact that it had become iconic as an example, and so it was particularly frustrating to lose something that was a symbol for people. And that was one of the things that really struck me when the city, and it must be said that the current local government is a very green and citizen engagement oriented party. When they said we couldn't possibly afford to pay, X amount of money for this small space, as if it only could be compared to equal sizes of, vegetated land or something, as opposed to saying by not maintaining this, we've essentially taken away a source of inspiration, probably caused people to lose hope. So I think there was a significant sort of symbolic loss as well as the daily experience of that for the neighbors or the people who passed through.
was a devaluing of not only a small public space relative to the perceived value of a big public space, but also more importantly, or equally importantly, a devaluation of the fact that people did take charge themselves. I can tell you that on the Nature of Cities, your piece got a lot of readers around the world, so there are people who are very into the story. We have another question, and this regards to the idea of the use of natural resources in public spaces. Question is from Gina Snyder. In a situation of dwindling public spaces and but then public use of those spaces in terms of provisioning and harvesting and so on, do we see a loss of the quality of those green spaces? And in particular, is there a tragedy of the commons in which this dependency on urban spaces ending up in their relative destruction?
I'll maybe go first, if I may. You do see a tragedy of the commons if things become open access, I think, and if the pressures are too large. And that is one of the challenges of growing cities in contexts like India, where original village communities, if you go to those in peri-urban areas, you might find maybe 30 or 40% of the people are from the village, and the remaining 60% are migrant communities, which maybe change every 2 weeks, every 3 months. Under such conditions, definitely you get. So I have heard, for instance, some community groups as well as some city officials argue that this is not the time for commons. In Indian cities, you need to wait for them to stabilize for about 20 years and make sure people that are there are going to stay there for a while, and then you can start handing over areas to communities. And right now, you need this thing to settle. I'm hesitant to go down that road though, because although there are challenges, I think the opportunities are also huge, and we do have some examples of successes, and we need to figure out ways in which to design these initiatives or help push them towards success rather than failure.
Charlie, do you have a thought?
If I could say something.
Please, Janice, yes.
I think that's a very interesting statement, and I mean, it's interesting to see in places like the UK that whole cycle that it's run of what had been public spaces that were well managed, and then through the years, now decades of cuts and austerity, essentially the local authorities really withdrew from managing those places. And in that initial stage, I mean, that left a bit of a void and a gap in a lot of areas that had been tremendous resources for every kind of cultural, recreational service, fell into something that essentially became a disservice. And it took a few years, but essentially people came in and started to manage that. So I think you can say that often if things sort of do get difficult, then concerned groups will gradually get together. And I think one of the ways that they did this was by starting to do interventions in the space that made it very apparent that this place was being reoccupied and that it was, hi, sorry, I'm having an interruption. I'm speaking in a, sorry, you better go to someone else.
Dave, can I add in on that question?
Yes, drop in.
I think it's an interesting question, but I would also respond in the sense that these spaces are dynamic. It would be unrealistic just because they're in an urban center to expect whether the space is formally created or whether it's an informal piece of wasteland on the edge of another plot, that they are going to be static through time. They're going to change. Urban areas are changing all the time. They're very dynamic. And so the pressures on these spaces also change. So it may well be that the quality, however you want to measure that, of a particular space may change over a number of years as particular uses are made of that space. But in doing so, then it's offering other and different services that it maybe didn't offer in the first instance. And so people are choosing spaces. They're selecting spaces on what's on offer at a particular time and space, and that can change. So many of these are disturbed sites, but they're highly resilient, and the nature of things they offer, I think we need to accept that they will change.
Yeah, I suppose we need to accept a dynamism of opening green spaces in cities while still paying attention to guarding against an overall diminution of both the quantity and quality of those spaces. That speaks to me also to the question of management. One of the core questions of the idea of a tragedy of the commons is a lack of organized management of those places. No one takes responsibility for them. And this is a question for everybody from Tim Winter. And that is, do we know of existing legislative, management, city-based processes which effectively integrate the actions of communities and government management for effectively integrating non-governmental and governmental actions in management of open spaces? The kinds of things examples you can imagine around the world could be things like urban gardening or beekeeping and so on. Are there some good examples around the world of integrating the non-governmental and governmental management of open spaces?
Well, it's Charlie here. The original phrasing of the question was, though, at a city-wide level. So I think Harini has mentioned, and I've mentioned, I'm sure Janice would have as well, individual examples or examples around individual spaces where there is cooperation and joint visioning between formal institutions, formal city governments and local citizenry. But at a citywide scale, I certainly can't think of one in the areas that I've visited.
I know from my own experience, I live in New York, and there in general is lots of citizen engagement around individual projects, but it's difficult to integrate them into the Parks Department's management of those spaces. Janice?
Thank you. I'm sorry, I've been removed from the room in the community center. You'll need to give me another minute.
Okay. We have another question from, and this might be our last question of the day, from Lavana Suresh. And it's a comment and a question. And her comment is, most citizen engagement, from her perspective, in the city and around commons is characterized by the elite. And so I think the question then is, would you comment on that, and I guess from two perspectives. Do you agree with that assessment, that it's the citizen engagement with the commons is a process of only the elite? Is that true? And if it is true, how would we change it? Harini, would you like to start?
Sure. What I find, or the way I would look at it, is that there is a lot of citizen engagement by elite as well as non-elite. What seems to get picked up by the media is the engagement by the elite, and that's largely because maybe it's the citizen engagement by the elite that is most successful, quote unquote, in the fact that they get the ears of the officials and therefore the legitimacy to continue with citizen management initiatives. I think you go to any place, the people that live around it and truly dependent on the commons are always engaging with the commons and trying to do things and meet their officials and organize. But in many cases, if they don't have the influence, that doesn't succeed. So it's not a question of engagement, but the success of the engagement or the acknowledgement of the legitimacy of that engagement from people in power. How do you change that? That's a much harder question, and I think we need much more debate, but definitely much more attention to this issue. So thank you for raising this.
There's an example in New York City that's relevant here. The gem of the park system in New York City is Central Park, a beautiful world-class park that's used by many, many people. What many people don't know about Central Park is that it's not managed by the city. It's managed by a public-private partnership called the Central Park Conservancy. And that Central Park Conservancy is funded by the very rich people who live around Central Park. And it's created a conversation in New York City about how do we manage local conservancies, so local park conservancies that contribute to the betterment of those parks. There's a number of them around New York City. So Central Park has a lot of rich people around it, and they contribute to that park. Madison Square Park is another example. There are lots of parks around New York that aren't surrounded by rich people, and they tend not to have those kinds of Central Park conservancies. And so the question is, should not those communities get the same kinds of parks as Central Park? It's a problem we're struggling with right now. On the one hand, it's great that the people who live around Central Park want to contribute to that park, and they've done a wonderful job with it. One of the open questions is, should the Central Park Conservancy tie them to other parks around the city to make them better? It's a very complicated question that creates, to some extent, an elitism, which the source of it is clear. It's not necessarily clear how to transcend it. Charlie, do you have any thoughts?
Just to share an interesting finding we published a couple of years ago, in which we were looking at, we did a willingness to pay study for public green space for recreation largely in a number of towns, and it soon came apparent that there was a wealth, an affluence difference, which I suppose is not unsurprising, that richer people around green spaces were more willing to pay larger amounts to maintain that green space. So then we revised the questionnaire, and then working in less affluent areas, we asked, well, if you're not willing to pay or unable to pay, would you be willing to engage in other ways, such as putting in an hour a week of labor or help attending meetings and planning? And there was a total inverse relationship there. So in the poorer areas, willingness to pay was very low, but willingness to engage time and meaningfully was a lot higher than the affluent areas, where they were willing to pay and say, oh, we'll give you whatever amount of money it is, just go and do the job. And they were far less willing to engage either with time or with visioning exercises. So we found that quite an interesting dichotomy. So is it elitist? Is it a matter of how many resources or what resources you've got available to be able to engage between authorities and local citizenry?
I think that's an excellent place to stop. So I want to thank all of the speakers, Harini, Janice, and Charlie, for being part of this webinar, and I especially want to thank Harini Nagendra for organizing it. Thank you also to ICLEI for hosting us. We will be back in a month with the next Urbis webinar. You can see what the next one is at the website above. Thank you all for attending. My name is David Maddox from The Nature of Cities. We'll see you next time.
Thank you very much for the audience and all the presenters. Look forward to further discussions on the urban commons at multiple venues. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you here, Charlie from South Africa. It was very nice participating and also receiving those stimulating questions.
And Janice here in London, I apologize for the chaos. I was in the middle of a community workshop today, but thank you for the opportunity to participate in this very interesting discussion.
Bye, everyone.